We're dealing with the Civil War, 1861 to 65. And during this period, if Negro slaves were able to make it to the side of the Union, they could become free. But this feat wasn't as easy as it first appears. In Dr. Litwack's 1979 book, Been in the Storm So Long, The Aftermath of Slavery, we'll study some of the obstacles that were in the way of reaching Union lines. It beginneth here.
If slavery was really so disagreeable, Mary Chestnut suggested rather smugly in July 1861,
why don't they all march over the border where they would be received with open arms? It amazes me.
Mary Chestnut was the wife of a prominent South Carolina planter, or slaveholder. She wrote this in her diary during the years of the war, and she was astonished how it was so that all the blacks didn't just get up and go to the Union where they would be received.
For all of her insights into the inscrutable slave, she was in no position to perceive the daring and courage required for a successful escape, the magnitude of the risks, and the certainty of severe punishment for those who failed,
which were all serious considerations for the many who did not flee. Now, apart from some genuinely wanting to stay, fear of failure, the unknown, and interference of slaveholders contributed to holding back many Negroes from crossing the line.
Ah, you know my brethren.
An elderly runaway told a group of freedmen
how they try to keep us from getting to Camp Nelson. Some of you have only just got from behind, where Massa asked you, would you like to be free, David? Of course I should. But then, if I say so, they just cross my hands, tie 'em up, strip me, then whip me with the cowhide till I tell a lie and say no.
Negroes desiring to be free was interpreted by many masters as a defect in black character. Their thinking was that those they called blacks were naturally meant to be slaves, and for slaves to go against this idea meant that something was wrong with them, and they needed a whipping until the defect was corrected. This was likely why the elderly man had to say no when the question of wanting to be free was asked.
That only a small percentage of slaves chose flight suggests the kinds of obstacles they faced. There were mounted citizens' patrols, river patrols, and Confederate sentinels that had to be eluded, as well as pursuing bloodhounds, the detective officers of slavery's police, one freedman called them.
The poor whites gladly volunteered for this position. Remember, they were created by the ruling class to do their dirty work, and all of this was part of it.
Some of the boats used by runaways broke apart or overturned, drowning the occupants, and nervous Union guards sometimes mistook escapees for enemy soldiers and shot and killed them.
And some probably did it on purpose, too. They had wild people in the North with the white consciousness who couldn't wait to catch or shoot an inward as well. So I would not be surprised if some of these were on purpose.
While attempting to escape across a river to the Union lines, a young slave and his mother were fired upon by the master's son. The mother managed to reach the other bank safely, but her son died soon afterwards from bullet wounds. Some years before, her husband and 2 other sons had been sold, and she was now left to lament her most recent and ironic fate.
My poor baby is shot dead by that young massa I nussed with my own boy. They was both babies together. Missus made me nuss her baby and set her little girl to watch me for fear I'd give my baby too much, no matter how hard he cried. Many times I wasn't allowed to take him up, and now that same boy has killed mine.
The same child she nursed was the same one that killed her boy. Can you imagine that? And I would bet those 2 boys probably started off as friends when they were children. But after they planted the white consciousness in his mind, he probably didn't want to be friends anymore, and he ended up eventually killing him, right? These Southern whites were something vicious back then.
Even if certain and severe punishment awaited apprehended runaways, they might have counted themselves fortunate to be returned to their masters.
Why is that?
In numerous instances, mounted slave patrols ran them down with their horses, shot them on the road, or tied them to the horses and dragged them to the nearest jail.
You see that? Hunting Negroes like hogs, and could easily shoot one of them because they looked at them through the same lens that they looked at other animals. So runaway slaves would rather deal with their master's punishment than to be left in the hands of one of these white patrollers.
Although hardly unique to the Civil War, the slave runaway most vividly demonstrated to an already apprehensive white South the breakdown and possible collapse of discipline and control. To many whites, in fact, there was little to distinguish the runaway from the rebel. Both threatened to bring down the system.
What system? Slavery, which was entangled with the ideology of white supremacy. Runaway Negroes were viewed in a similar light as a person trying to mess up their God-ordained way of life in the South. These people were willing to die for that system, which is how the Civil War began in the first place, right? And what is a system? It's a way of doing things to achieve a predictable or somewhat predictable result. The way of doing things for the South was chattel slavery based upon a concept of race. And the predictable result were that those labeled as whites would be on the top in the Southern society, and those labeled as blacks are at the very bottom, right? Running threatened to bring down this system, which is why there was little to distinguish the runaway from the rebel. Let's keep going.
And reports of new desertions invariably fueled talk of subversion, insurrection, and the very death of slavery.
They are traitors who may pilot an enemy into your bedchamber.
The Reverend C.C. Jones of Georgia warned.
Who is this? This is the same Reverend Charles Colcock Jones who wrote the religious instructions for the Negroes. Do we remember him? This is the same person that's poking his head out again. He's saying that the runaways are traitors that could lead the Union back to their masters' homes.
They know every road and swamp and creek and plantation in the county and are the worst of spies. If the absconding is not stopped, the Negro property of the county will be of little value.
If we don't stop them from running away, the Negroes as property will be of little value, right? This is the good Reverend speaking like this.
This usually reserved churchman, who prided himself on his religious work with the slaves.
What religious work was he doing with the slaves? The type of religious ideas he planted in the garden of their mind was to achieve what purpose? In case we forgot, let's hear it from his own mouth.
For the duty of giving religious instruction to our Negroes and the benefits flowing from it should be obvious to all.
Obvious to all slaveholders, which were his audience.
The benefits we conceive to be incalculably great, and some of them are the following. 1. There will be a better understanding of the mutual relations of master and servant. 2. There will be greater subordination and a decrease of crime amongst the Negroes.
Interpreting the Bible in such a way to make subordinate and obedient slaves, right? That's what he did. So this godly man who prided himself on his religious work with slaves
became so deeply disturbed over the mounting reports of runaways in the neighborhood that he suggested the need to define them as insurrectionists and mete out summary justice.
Runaways had his skin boiling, and boiling to the point where he wanted slaves to be punished quickly without any formal trial.
After all, he wrote his son in the Confederate Army,
They declare themselves enemies and at war with owners by going over to the enemy who is seeking both our lives and property.
Responding to his father's concerns, Charles C. Jones, Jr., who had served as mayor of Savannah before enlisting in the Army, disdained anything that would
savor of mob law,
but agreed that defectors who evinced sufficient intelligence and leadership qualities to devise
a matured plan of escape,
and to influence others to flee should be treated as armed insurrectionists and executed.
So he didn't agree with his father on punishment without a formal process. But he did suggest that the intelligent ones who created the plans and led the escapes, they should be put to death.
if insensible to every other consideration.
Colonel Jones suggested,
Terror must be made to operate upon their minds.
This is for the other slaves who may have considered running. If we can't reason with them and show them why it's morally wrong to run away or that it's against the word of God, and if they're unaffected by any of these considerations, then the tool of terror must be used to deter their minds.
And fear prevent what curiosity and desire for utopian pleasures induce them to attempt.
What is fear? It's energy concentrated in a specific form that strongly influences the body to act or not to act in a certain way. And it can be activated and directed in people by others who know what they're doing, like slaveholders and rulers of people. He wanted to excite fear in people and use that concentrated energy as a tool to stop them from being curious or desiring to escape to freedom, right? You see how that works? These are the mind games that whites had been using to create slaves out of the people they brought to America and their descendants, right? They were working with this type of understanding. Let's continue.
Nearly everyone loyal to the Confederacy conceded that the effectiveness of any system designed to thwart slave desertions rested ultimately on local and individual vigilance. While some whites might choose to debate legal niceties, most of them were concerned only with achieving immediate and conclusive results. Henry A. Middleton, a South Carolina planter, obviously appreciated the dispatch with which Georgetown County had dealt with apprehended runaways.
Of the people who went away, 3 men returned to the plantation of Dr. Mickell and carried away their wives. The 6 were taken together, making their way to the enemy. The men were tried yesterday by the Provost Marshal's court. They were sentenced to be hung. Today 1 o'clock was fixed for the execution that no executive clemency might intervene. There was a crowd. The blacks were encouraged to be present. The effect will not soon be forgotten.
That's the instilling fear and terror to operate upon their minds. As soon as a person sees another get executed for running, then it automatically excites fear in a person, which will make them reconsider running if they were thinking the slightest bit about doing it. Only the people who really could care less about the consequences would dare any type of attempt afterwards. And the thing is, there's always those people, but they are relatively few.
What compounded the problem of control was the difficulty of anticipating defections. Every slave owner would have to make his own determination and act accordingly. Anxious about retaining his house servant and cook, a Georgia planter put heavy iron shackles on her feet while she worked and locked her in the cornhouse at night. In the Mississippi River region, a Union officer who returned from a raid with 200 slaves reported having found 25 of them chained in a canebrake.
This stuff is wild, isn't it?
On the plantation in Virginia where Susie Burns labored, any slave contemplating an escape during the war years needed to elude the vigilant eye and drunken wrath of the master.
Used to set in his big chair on the porch with a jug of whiskey by his side, drinking and watching the quarters to see that didn't none of his slaves start slipping away.
More commonly, a slave owner made an example of runaways who were apprehended and returned to the plantation. If not immediately sold, they were liable to be whipped, chained at night, put to work on Confederate fortifications, or removed for safekeeping to non-threatened areas. After thwarting an attempted escape, the son of a South Carolina planter sold 2 of the leaders in Charleston and punished the others
by whips and handcuffing,
making certain that they were chained and watched at night. But some planters, acting as though their tenure as slave owners might be short-lived, were so unnerved by defections that they vented all of their frustrations on those they could apprehend.
When the Union soldiers were near us,
a freedwoman named Affie recalled,
some of the young hands run off to get to the Union folks, and Massa catched them and hanged them to a tree and shoot them. He think no more'n to shoot the culled people right down. But thank God I got away, and him won't get me again.
You see that? This is why many who thought of running did not run. They were surrounded by many obstacles, and fear lingered within their being at all times. And although most did not make the attempt, some did. And they were both unsuccessful and successful, right? This is just how it goes in this reality. But we continue it to the next. I thank you for your time. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.